February 9th, 1962. St. John's Cemetery, Queens, New York. Outside the chapel, over 2,000 people stand in the bitter February cold. Black coats, black suits, black dresses, breath rising in white clouds against the gray winter sky. Inside, the most powerful crime bosses in America have gathered to bury a legend. Charles, just quote. Luciano, the man who invented modern organized crime, who transformed street gangs into a corporate empire, who created the commission that brought order to chaos. But this isn't just a funeral. This is a trap. Hidden among those 2,000 mourners are 12 gunmen, soldiers loyal to Vito Genovese, a man rotting in federal prison but still pulling strings from behind bars. Their weapons are concealed beneath heavy overcoats. Their instructions are simple. When Carlo Gambino, the most powerful mob boss in New York, steps up to the podium to deliver the eulogy, they open fire in front of 2,000 witnesses, in front of every major crime family in the country, in front of cameras and FBI agents and reporters. It would be the most audacious assassination in Mafia history. A statement so bold that no one would ever question who really controlled the underworld. There's just one problem. Bumpy Johnson already knows about it. And what he does in the next 90 minutes won't just save Carlo Gambino's life. It will fundamentally alter the balance of power between Harlem and the Italian mob forever. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson outsmarted the five families without firing a single shot. Now, to truly understand what happened on that frozen February morning, you need to understand who Lucky Luciano was and why his death created a power vacuum that nearly drowned New York in blood. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, Lucky Luciano arrived in America as a child, with nothing but ambition and an absolute refusal to accept the limits society placed on men like him. He rose through New York's criminal underworld with a combination of ruthless violence and genuine intelligence that set him apart from every other gangster of his era. In the early 1930s, Luciano accomplished something no one had ever managed before. He ended the wars. For decades, rival gangs had been slaughtering each other over territory, over insults, over business disputes that spiraled into bloodbaths. The Castellammarese War alone had killed dozens of made men and bosses. The chaos was bad for everyone, bad for business, bad for survival, bad for building anything that would last. Luciano saw a different way. He created the commission, a governing council of the five families that would divide territory, settle disputes through negotiation rather than bullets, and run organized crime like what it truly was. A business. A massive, illegal, ruthless business, but a business nonetheless. He turned chaos into empire. And for that he became the closest thing the American underworld ever had to a founding father. But in 1936, federal prosecutors convicted Luciano on forced prostitution charges, charges many believed were manufactured, and sent him to prison with a sentence of 30 to 50 years. Then came World War II. The U.S. government had a problem. Nazi submarines were sinking Allied ships off the American coast. Saboteurs threatened the New York waterfront, the most strategically important port in the country. The military needed help, and they turned to an unlikely source, Lucky Luciano. From his prison cell, Luciano gave the order, cooperate with the government. His dock workers became the eyes and ears of naval intelligence. Suspected saboteurs were identified and neutralized. The waterfront stayed secure throughout the war. In exchange, Luciano expected freedom. What he got was exile. In 1946, the government released him from prison, but immediately deported him to Italy. He spent the remaining 16 years of his life watching his empire from across an ocean, still respected, still consulted, still feared, but never allowed to return to the country he'd helped build. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano collapsed at Naples International Airport, heart attack. He was 64 years old. The Italian government, in a rare gesture for a deported criminal, agreed to return. his body to the United States for burial. His funeral was scheduled for February 9th at St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Every major figure in organized crime would attend. It was mandatory. To skip Lucky Luciano's funeral would be an insult that could never be forgiven. Carlo Gambino, boss of the most powerful family in New York, was selected to deliver the eulogy. This wasn't just an honor. It was a coronation, a public acknowledgement that Gambino was now the unofficial boss of bosses, the man who would carry Luciano's legacy forward into the next generation. Not everyone accepted that arrangement. Vito Genovese was sitting in a cell at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, serving 15 years for drug trafficking. But prison walls had never stopped Genovese from running his family. He still issued orders through trusted messengers. He still controlled soldiers on the outside. He still believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who had killed his way to the top, that he, not Carlo Gambino, should be standing at that podium. Genovese had been one of Luciano's top lieutenants in the glory days. When Luciano went to prison in 1936, Genovese fully expected to inherit the empire. But Luciano had chosen Frank Costello instead, and Genovese spent years seething in Costello's shadow. By 1957, Genovese had finally made his move. He orchestrated an assassination attempt on Costello, a bullet that grazed the older man's skull but left him alive. Costello got the message and retired. Genovese thought he'd finally won. Then came 1959, and the federal drug case that put him behind bars. Many in the underworld believed Carlo Gambino had orchestrated that conviction, had fed information to prosecutors, had maneuvered his rival into a trap. Whether true or not, the result was the same. Genovese was locked up and powerless, while Gambino ascended to the throne. Now, in February 1962, Gambino was about to be crowned in front of the entire criminal world at Lucky Luciano's funeral. Genovese couldn't allow that. So he made a decision that would have set New York on fire. If he couldn't rule the commission, he would burn it to the ground, starting with Carlo Gambino, January 18, 1962, 3 weeks before the funeral. Bumpy Johnson was sitting in his office above Small's Paradise nightclub on 135th Street in Harlem. The same office where he'd run his operations for years. The same desk where he'd made decisions that shaped the neighborhood's fate. One of his street captains appeared at the door. "Boss, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." "Who?" "Won't give his name, but he's Italian and he looks scared." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Send him in." The man who walked through that door was thin, early 30s, wearing a cheap overcoat that didn't quite hide the expensive suit underneath. Bumpy recognized him immediately. Vincent, quote 5, Calabrese, a low-level soldier in the Genovese family who ran collections in East Harlem, small time. Nobody important, but 3 years earlier, Vinny had been caught in a police raid on a numbers operation. If the cops had searched him properly, they would have found $12,000 in cash stuffed into his jacket. Enough to send him away for years. Bumpy had been there that night, had watched the cops closing in, had made a split-second decision. Bumpy told the officers, and the cops, who knew better than to argue with Bumpy Johnson over a small-time Italian nobody, let Vinny walk. Vinny had owed Bumpy his freedom ever since. Now he was here to pay that debt. He sat down across from Bumpy, hands trembling visibly. Bumpy said calmly, quote 9. Vinny took a breath that shuddered through his entire body. Quote 10. Bumpy's expression didn't change, not a blink, not a twitch. He just waited. Vinny continued, the words tumbling out now. Bumpy asked. Vinny met Bumpy's eyes directly. The first brave thing he'd done since walking through that door. He paused. Bumpy studied the man for a long time, measured him, weighed the sincerity of his words against every angle, every possibility that this was a setup. Then he reached into his desk, pulled out an envelope thick with cash, and slid it across the surface. Quote 18. Quote 19. quote 20. Vinny took the envelope. His eyes were wet as he stood. He didn't say anything else. Just walked out the door and disappeared into the Harlem night. Bumpy sat alone in his office for a long time after that. He could warn Gambino. That was the obvious move. Pick up the phone. Pass along the intelligence. Let the Italians handle their own business. Gambino would be grateful, would owe Bumpy a favor. But that approach had problems. It would make Bumpy look weak, like he needed the mob's protection, like he was a messenger boy rather than a power in his own right. Worse, it would make him look like a snitch, and in the world Bumpy inhabited, that label was a death sentence. No, Bumpy Johnson didn't warn people, he handled problems, and he had exactly 3 weeks to handle this one. Most men facing this situation would have panicked, would have called in every favor, hired extra guns, maybe tried to cancel the funeral entirely. Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. He understood something fundamental about power that most people never grasp. The man who controls information controls everything. Genovese's shooters believed they had the element of surprise. They believed no one knew about the hit except the people directly involved. They believed they would walk into that chapel, take their positions, and execute their mission without interference. But Bumpy knew, and that knowledge was worth more than any number of guns. Over the next 3 weeks, Bumpy made a series of moves so subtle, so precisely calculated, that even his closest associates didn't understand what he was doing until it was over. Move 1. Infiltration. Bumpy contacted a man named Marcus Henderson, a longtime associate who ran a small funeral services company in Harlem. Legitimate business, but with connections to Bumpy's world. "I need you to place some of your people on a job," Bumpy said. "What kind of job?" "Luciano's funeral. I need drivers, pallbearers, ushers, people who can blend into the background, but keep their eyes open and be ready to move if things go wrong." Smooth understood immediately. He'd known Bumpy for 20 years. He didn't need detailed explanations. How many? 8. Within a week, 8 of Bumpy's most trusted men were embedded in the funeral operation. They wore the same black suits as the other staff. They carried the same programs. They looked like exactly what they were supposed to look like. Hired help, invisible to anyone who mattered. But they reported directly to Bumpy. Move 2. Misdirection. Bumpy reached out to an old contact. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who'd served in Harlem for 2 decades. During the riots of the 1940s, when fires threatened to consume the neighborhood, Bumpy's people had protected Father O'Brien's church, had stood guard while the city burned around them. The priest had never forgotten. "Father, I need a favor, a significant one. Anything, Bumpy. You know that. I need you at St. John's Cemetery on February 9th, near the chapel entrance. And if I give you a signal, I need you to cause a distraction." What kind of distraction? The kind that makes everyone look away for 10 seconds. Father O'Brien didn't ask questions. He'd learned long ago that sometimes faith meant trusting the men who protected your flock. Even when you didn't understand their methods, he simply nodded. Move 3. The intelligence. This was the crucial piece. Genovese's 12 shooters would be seated in specific positions, close enough to Gambino to guarantee accuracy, but spread out enough to avoid suspicion. To neutralize them, Bumpy needed to know exactly where those seats were. He couldn't visit the funeral home himself. That would draw far too much attention. Instead, he sent someone who would never raise suspicions. Her name was Claudette, one of Madame Stéphanie Saint, Claire's most elegant operatives, tall, sophisticated, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and be treated like she belonged there. She arrived at the funeral director's office wearing a black dress, a string of pearls, and a carefully crafted story about being Lucky Luciano's distant cousin, who needed to confirm her family's seating arrangements. The director, eager to please anyone connected to the legendary Luciano, showed her the complete seating chart without hesitation. Claudette memorized every detail in 30 seconds: seat numbers, aisle positions, exit locations. By that evening, Bumpy had a hand-drawn map of the entire chapel layout, and he knew exactly where Genovese's 12 killers would be sitting. Move 4. The reversal. This was the masterstroke. 2 nights before the funeral, when the chapel was dark and empty, Bumpy's people went to work. They switched the seat markers. The 12 seats reserved for Genovese's shooters, prime positions with clear sightlines to the podium, were quietly reassigned to harmless mourners, elderly widows, distant Luciano relatives, low-level associates with no connection to the hit, and the shooters themselves. They would be redirected to seats in the back rows, far from Gambino, separated from each other, surrounded by strangers. By the time Genovese's men arrived on February 9th, the trap they'd spent weeks planning would be turned completely against them, and they would never even realize it. The morning of February 9th, 1962, dawned gray and bitter. By 9 a.m., over 2,000 people had gathered outside St. John's Cemetery. Reporters lined the streets with cameras ready. FBI agents stood on nearby rooftops with binoculars photographing every face for their files. Inside the chapel, the most powerful criminals in America took their seats. Bosses and underbosses and consiglieri from every major family. Men who controlled billions of dollars in illegal enterprise. Men who had ordered deaths with the same casual indifference most people use to order lunch. Carlo Gambino arrived at 9:45, flanked by 6 bodyguards. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, black tie, dark sunglasses that concealed his eyes, but couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. Gambino knew something was wrong. He could feel it the way a gazelle feels a lion watching from the tall grass. Funerals were dangerous. Too many rivals gathered in one place. Too many opportunities for violence disguised as chaos. But this was Lucky Luciano's funeral, the man who had built everything they all now enjoyed. Not attending would have been an unforgivable insult, the kind that could destroy alliances built over decades. So Gambino came, and he prayed, perhaps for the first time in years, that he would leave alive. At 10:15, the service began. The chapel was packed beyond capacity, standing room only, the air thick with perfume and tension and the heavy scent of funeral flowers. Bumpy Johnson was not inside. He stood outside near the parking lot, wearing a long black coat and a fedora pulled low over his eyes. To any observer, he looked like just another mourner, someone paying respects from a respectful distance, perhaps not important enough to warrant a seat inside. But Bumpy's eyes never stopped moving, scanning the crowd, watching the entrances, waiting. He spotted them immediately. 12 men arriving separately over the span of 20 minutes, all wearing nearly identical black overcoats, all moving with the particular purpose of professionals approaching a job. Genovese's shooters, right on schedule. Bumpy watched as they entered the chapel one by one, showed their invitations to the ushers, were directed to their seats. Only those seats weren't where they expected to be. Inside the chapel, confusion rippled silently through the 12 assassins. One by one, they realized they'd been placed in the back rows, far from Gambino, separated from each other by dozens of strangers, surrounded by elderly women and minor associates who had no idea what was supposed to happen. They couldn't cause a scene, couldn't demand different seats, couldn't do anything that would draw attention, so they sat down and waited for an opportunity that would never come. The eulogy began. Carlo Gambino walked to the podium with the measured steps of a man who had survived decades in the most dangerous profession on earth. He looked out over the sea of faces, friends and enemies alike, all gathered to honor the dead. Quote 32. Gambino said, his voice steady and clear. Quote 33. He paused. Quote 34. In the back row, one of Genovese's men made eye contact with another across the aisle. A silent communication passed between them. The plan had failed. They were too far away, too exposed. If they opened fire now, they'd hit innocent mourners and accomplish nothing. Worse, Gambino's bodyguards would cut them down before they could reach the exits. The hit was off. Outside, Bumpy Johnson watched as the service concluded without incident. The mourners filed out in orderly rows. Gambino emerged surrounded by his security detail, moving quickly toward his waiting car. The 12 shooters left separately, their faces tight with frustration and fear. They had failed a man who did not tolerate failure. Their futures had become very uncertain. But here's what none of them understood. Bumpy Johnson had saved their lives too. Because if those 12 men had opened fire on Carlo Gambino in a chapel packed with 2,000 people, the bodyguards would have returned fire instantly. In that confined space, with panicked civilians stampeding toward exits, the body count would have been catastrophic. Dozens dead, families destroyed, and Harlem, caught directly in the middle of the mob war that would have followed, would have burned for years. Bumpy had prevented all of that. Not with guns, not with violence, with intelligence, with strategy, with 3 weeks of preparation that no one even knew had happened. 3 days after the funeral, a message arrived at Bumpy's office, simple and direct. A black Cadillac would pick him up at 8 p.m. on the corner of 125th and Lenox. No names given, no details provided, just an invitation that was really a summons. Bumpy knew exactly who it was from. At precisely 8 p.m. they could see the Cadillac appeared. Bumpy climbed into the back seat. The driver said nothing, didn't even glance in the rear-view mirror. They drove south through Manhattan, across the Brooklyn Bridge, deep into territory that had never welcomed men who looked like Bumpy Johnson. The car stopped outside a small Italian restaurant on Mulberry Street. Little Italy, the heart of Gambino's world. The restaurant was dark, closed for the night, but lights glowed behind the curtained windows. Bumpy walked in. Carlo Gambino sat alone at a corner table. 2 glasses of red wine rested on the white tablecloth, both untouched. 2 chairs, one empty. "Mr. Johnson," Gambino said, gesturing toward the vacant seat. "Please." Bumpy sat. For a long moment, neither man spoke. 2 predators measuring each other across a small table in an empty restaurant. Then Gambino leaned forward. "I know what you did." Bumpy said nothing. His expression revealed nothing. "I don't know how you found out about it," Gambino continued. "I don't know how you stopped it. My own intelligence failed to catch what you somehow discovered weeks in advance." He picked up one of the wine glasses and slid it across the table toward Bumpy. "You could have let me die. Could have sat back and watched Genovese's men cut me down. My family would have torn itself apart in the aftermath. Chaos everywhere. And chaos, for a man like you, means opportunity." Gambino's dark eyes studied Bumpy's face. "But you didn't let that happen. Why?" Bumpy finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "Because Harlem doesn't need your war. My people don't need to die because you and Genovese can't settle your differences like civilized men." Gambino nodded slowly. A hint of something, respect perhaps, flickered across his stone face. "You're more intelligent than most of the men I work with. Most of the men I've ever known, actually." He raised his glass slightly. "From this day forward, Harlem belongs to you. Completely. My family will not interfere with your operations. We will not push into your territory. We will not attempt to buy your people or undermine your authority." "And in return?" Bumpy asked. "In return, you stay out of Brooklyn, out of the Bronx, out of Staten Island. We respect each other's boundaries." "And if someone doesn't respect that arrangement?" Gambino's expression hardened. Quote 48. Bumpy considered this for a moment. Then he picked up his wine glass. Quote 49. Quote 50. Quote 51. For the first time anyone could remember, Carlo Gambino smiled, a rare sight from a man famous for his expressionless face. They touched glasses, drank in silence. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of that restaurant, he had secured something no black man in New York had ever achieved before. Not tolerance from the five families, not fear, respect, genuine respect from the most powerful criminal organization in America. The 12 shooters who failed to kill Gambino didn't survive long. Within a month, most had vanished. Some were found floating in the Hudson River, their bodies weighted down with chains. Others simply disappeared. No bodies ever recovered, no explanations ever offered. Vito Genovese, still rotting in his prison cell, eventually realized that someone had betrayed him. Someone had known about the hit in advance. But he never discovered who. Never learned that Bumpy Johnson, a man he'd probably never given a moment's thought to, had been the one pulling strings from the shadows. Genovese died in prison in 1969. Powerless. Forgotten. A cautionary tale about the cost of overreaching. Carlo Gambino, on the other hand, ruled New York's underworld for another 14 years. He became the most powerful mob boss in American history, a man whose influence extended into legitimate business, into politics, into every corner of American life. And he never forgot what Bumpy Johnson had done for him. When Bumpy died in 1968, Gambino sent an enormous wreath to his funeral. The gesture shocked everyone who witnessed it. A mafia boss publicly honoring a black gangster? Unprecedented. Unheard of. But those who understood the truth, who knew what had really happened on that frozen February morning in 1962, those people understood perfectly. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just saved Carlo Gambino's life. He had saved the peace. February 9th, 1962. A day that should have ended in massacre. A day that should have ignited a war lasting years, costing hundreds of lives, destroying everything Lucky Luciano had spent decades building. Instead, it became the day Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that real power has nothing to do with how many guns you command. Real power is intelligence. Real power is strategy. Real power is the courage to act when no one else even sees the danger coming. Lucky Luciano was buried that day. But the system he created, the commission, the delicate balance of power between the families, survived. Because one man stood in the shadows and refused to let it fall. That man was Bumpy Johnson. And his legacy? It echoes through every story about someone who was smarter than their enemies, someone who protected their community without asking for credit, someone who won the most dangerous game without ever firing a shot. That's not just gangster legend, that's a blueprint for how power really works.